Hi, I'm Cody Sims. I live here in Truckee, California, and I'm the clinic director of Kensho WELLBEING here in Truckee.
My name's Helen. My name's Helen Mino Faulkner. I am 26. I live in Truckee, California. I have a lot of jobs, but I am currently a trail and ultra runner.
All right, Helen, how are you feeling after your blood draw?
I'm feeling good.
Good. How was the coffee?
It was super good.
We use Ralph Pacific Crest across the street. Still the best coffee in Truckee. They roast it locally right here. The reason we don't want people to have their coffee before they come in for a lab draw is it will change some things on the lab. Mostly cortisol. When you wake up in the morning, you have something called a cortisol awakening response. And there's a certain timeline as to when your cortisol should spike. And then it sort of declines throughout the day. When you have coffee, we see a much earlier spike and even a higher spike. So it changes a little bit about the labs. The other thing coffee does is it dehydrates you. We don't want you to be dehydrated when you come in. So tell me what brings you here. Tell me a little bit about your background as an athlete. What makes you interested in going through our process?
Yeah, so I mostly run ultras and other trail races, and I think what made me super interested about getting my blood panel done was just that there's a lot of things about my health that I can't see, and so I thought that this would be a good way to get more insight and finding ways that I can improve my health.
Awesome. When we look at health holistically, there are a lot of different biomarkers that we can look at. So in our practice, we like to get as much data as possible. In some places, they might say we're overreaching, we're getting markers that are not important. But I would say every biomarker is important as long as it's looked at in the context of the history, of the physical exam, and also whether or not there's a constellation of biomarkers that are pointing in a similar direction. So a lot of the biomarkers we work with are regarding vitamins, regarding minerals, looking at how healthy your blood is. And we do that in a few different ways. We look at metabolism. And so we care a lot about how well your body disposes of glucose. You know, glucose and fat are the primary sources of fuel that your body uses. Protein is really about building blocks. But when we get this data, when we go through the entire process, we can really determine the optimum ins and outs for fueling your body. We care a lot about fuel partitioning. And then we care about things like respiratory capacity. We care about VO2 max. We care about all of the things that we can work on to improve performance as well as improve your long-term health and your health span. Tell me about some of your health goals. If you're thinking about the races, you're thinking about recovery, what would be some things that we could help you kind of hone in on?
I think one of my biggest goals is just to be able to run for a long time. So until at least for the next 15 to 20 years, I'd like to be able to run. And so just figuring out things that'll help me be able to get there.
Great.
Without getting injured.
Injury prevention is a huge thing. So looking at all of the things around recovery, there's a lot of different markers that we can use to determine your recovery path. Some of them have to do with heart rate variability. There's a lot of good science around heart rate variability. Every wearable is looking at the way they're determining your sleep patterns, for example. If we see that there's certain things that are causing your heart rate variability to decline over a period of time, we'd like to dive into those things and determine, is there a metabolic thing that's happening? Is it overtraining? Is it poor sleep? All of those things are really important for short-term and long-term progress.
Yeah, how can you tell the level of my metabolism from my blood?
Yeah, great question. So there are a few things that are looked at in a traditional doctor's office, and one of them is your fasting glucose. Fasting glucose is pretty important, but it's just a moment in time. And so we do it with a 12-hour fast. We want to see that your blood glucose is not above 100 after 12 hours. And if we want to think about energy in the body, glucose is a form of energy, or one of the two forms. We don't want sugar to be hanging out in your blood. Your blood is really a shuttle to be able to allow the sugar to get from your metabolism, which is centered around your liver. Your liver produces and stores glucose. And then your muscles also store and use the vast majority of glucose in your body. All of that glucose has to be used by your muscles and by your brain. If there's an inefficiency in transporting the sugar, it hangs out in your blood and it gets stuck there. And so we care a lot about not just that fasting glucose, we actually care about your glucose levels through the night, through the day, looking at the trends on glucose. We use a program called continuous glucose monitoring. I don't know if you've seen the patches that people who have diabetes wear. What I always tell people is wear a continuous glucose monitor for 10 days so that you don't want to have to wear one for the rest of your life.
Oh, well, I was just thinking, like, I eat a lot of sugar while I'm running.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely, like, my main source of energy, like, for these really long runs. So
yeah, absolutely.
I wonder how that impacts my glucose.
That would be a really good thing to measure, and there's a bunch of different ways we can measure it. The continuous glucose monitor tells us what your blood sugar looks like the whole time during that 10-day period that we put it on you. And that will help us see what your blood sugar look like while you're running, what your blood sugar look like before, after a meal, and then we like to look at variability. And we don't want a lot of variability in your blood sugar because variability means you're having inefficiency in transporting that glucose basically from your liver, where it's being made or stored, into the muscles where it's being used. So there is a paradigm where, this has been going on for many, many years, that we're all, as athletes, are supposed to do carb loading. We're supposed to eat a tremendous amount of carbs so that we save up enough energy in order to complete our race or event. There is some truth to that. You do need enough carbohydrates to do it, but that philosophy is really kind of pushed overboard, and we find that most people are eating too many carbohydrates relative to their energy expenditure. And that's really detrimental because when you start to eat too many carbs, you have a lot of variability with the insulin response, and we can measure all of these things in the blood. We can measure with the continuous glucose monitor, and we can measure with the VO2 max machine. And it will tell us how well your body burns sugar during exercise, how well it burns fat during exercise, and at rest, the total caloric intake that your body needs at rest and during exercise, and then the ratios. And for many people, we find the ratios are off. A lot of people are eating too many, even if they're exercising tremendous amounts, they're still eating too many carbs. And that causes the blood sugar to fluctuate a lot, and that's why a lot of people are bonking during their events, and they're trying to compensate for the bonking by eating more sugar, and by doing that, they're reinforcing that cycle.
Well, that's actually that's really interesting because like I said, I mostly eat carbs while I'm running because they're simple sugars and easier for me to digest. But I started eating more carbs while running than I was previously, and I feel like I felt better in recovery.
Yep.
Oh man. Yeah, I'm trying to think. It's probably, I ran rim to rim to rim in the Grand Canyon last October.
Wow.
And
how many miles is that?
About 46.
Whew. And how much altitude gain?
I think it's close to like 15,000.
Wow, that's like running up half of Mount Everest or more than that.
Yeah, I did it at the very end of my race season, so it was almost exactly a year ago, and I was still pretty tired, but I did it with some of my friends, and that's when I learned that it doesn't really matter how slow you run, running 45 miles is still running 45 miles. And I definitely didn't bring enough food, and I was just tired the whole time pretty much, and I think it took me like 10 hours, So I
Wow.
think that was the second biggest run I had ever done.
That's a pretty phenomenal time to do that much altitude and that much mileage. What did it look like when you bonked? What happened?
Oh, I was tired and dizzy, and I didn't want to run anymore. The last climb out of the Grand Canyon, it was like starting to get dark, and I just didn't want to run. I was walking most of like the last climb out, and normally I feel pretty good, like going up hills, and
Okay.
I just had no energy.
Were your muscles cramping? Were you having a lot of signs that your hydration level was off?
Yeah, I was probably dehydrated. It was cold and snowy up towards the top.
Okay.
Like there was still ice at the rim of the Grand Canyon, and then down towards the bottom, it was pretty hot. And so I underestimated how much water I would need too. And since it was October, I think one of the water sources we were expecting to still be on wasn't. Yeah, so then I started getting cramping like in my calves and like through my feet.
Wow. How do you normally feel yourself before a race? If you're thinking about leading up to the race, days before, what's your nutrition look like?
It's usually, I try not to change too much compared to what I eat normally. I don't think I do anything super specific going into races.
Okay.
Just because I feel like a lot of what I eat normally works well for me.
Okay. Have you found, I guess, have you ever done any tracking around what those macros look like? Looking at, how much protein you're getting, how much fat you're getting, how many carbohydrates you're getting. Have you ever done any kind of work with that?
Mm-mm.
Okay. I think it's an interesting thing for people to do. It's not something you have to do all the time. It's not that you need to start tracking your food and then be really detail oriented about it, because that's pretty cumbersome. But it's a good baseline, because hardly anyone seems to know what they eat until they track. Mm-hmm. The reason we like to do this is if we can get those macro ratios, and then we can analyze your metabolism through continuous glucose monitoring, through the VO2 max testing, the zone testing. We can see if those macros make sense for you, if what you're doing is consistent with what your body's energy needs and fuel partitioning look like. There's always, it seems, a place for improvement. Even if you feel like you figured out what's working for you, you've been running and training for many years, you have a really good sense of what your body needs, you may determine from this testing that there are a few things that you can tweak, or maybe major things that you can tweak. Do you have any specific nutrition ideas or things that you have learned about that seem to work for you, or that you really like doing?
Yeah, I have a lot of food intolerances.
Okay.
And so I feel like that kind of limits a lot of what I can and can't eat. And I guess like my philosophy is just trying to eat real foods for the most part, like less
Great.
processed things.
Okay, great. That is for many people, the beginning is just saying, let's see what's in the box. Have you ever looked at nutrient deficiencies before?
A little bit. I haven't had testing done on them, but just because of where we live, like I know vitamin D is a big thing because of the angle of our sun. So I went to herbal medicine school, and that was like one of the main focuses was magnesium and vitamin D. And then in college, there was a lot of focus on like iron deficiencies, but I've never had testing done other than my iron.
Okay. We like to focus on all of these things and look at them within the context of the reference range. And so, unfortunately, in kind of traditional medicine, if you are within this normal range, let's say the range for vitamin D is 30 to 100. If you're above 30, most doctors' offices would say that's completely normal, even if you're 31 or 32, and they just turn a blind eye to it, and they say, oh, don't worry about it, you're at 32. You have the minimum value to be healthy. And I think that's also true for nutrition. When we look at things like protein, for example, there's something called a recommended dietary allowance, and The studies for the RDA were developed in Africa, looking at whether or not 98% of the population would not develop severe disease, and severe malnourishment. So when we look at something like protein, I think in many cases the recommended dietary allowance is around 30 to 50 grams of protein. What it means is that people who eat 30 to 50 grams of protein, 2% of them will develop severe malnourishment. We don't want people to do the minimum. We really want to focus on optimal nutrition. And one of the things we find in athletes is a lot of athletes are not consuming enough digestible protein. There's been a lot of research. The nutritional biochemistry would say that the minimum for maintaining the lean body mass that you have in terms of muscles is 1.6 grams per kilo. And what that looks like for most people, let's say a 70 kilo person, it's 120 grams. That's the absolute minimum. Going forward of that, what we really want is for people to continuously gain muscle, especially as an athlete, because muscle is the way that you store and dispose of glucose. Has a lot to do with supporting your skeleton, obviously has a lot to do with athletic performance, but even looking into longevity, muscle starts to decline in around the 4th decade, and it's very difficult to continue building muscle without an intense resistance training program. As muscle declines, it turns out hormones decline. It turns out bone density starts to decline. And when we look at the literature talking about something like hip fractures, people in their 70s have a 25% 1-year mortality for a hip fracture. So it's extraordinarily high. It takes a long time as you get older to put more and more muscle on. It takes a long time to put bone on. There's kind of a threshold. Once people kind of move into their 4th decade, the bone density stops gaining and it starts to decline. And so in our practice, we like to do DEXA scans where we actually send people down to evaluate bone density and also to look at body composition. Within body composition, we care about really muscle density and then something called visceral fat content. There is a strong association with visceral fat content and all sorts of metabolic disease. It's a good idea to get a baseline of your bone density because we can look prospectively and we can say, if this is your score now, we know what your bone density is now, what is it going to look like in 20 years? Mm-hmm. And we like to do the modifiable things that we can so that you don't develop bone loss, osteopenia, and then osteoporosis later in life. Mm-hmm. Do you do any resistance training? Do you do weightlifting? Have you thought about things that directly impact bone density, muscle gain?
Yeah, so I was doing some weight training previously, but I've stopped doing it.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's see. I run pretty much 6 days a week typically. I'll have 1 to 2 long runs. They're usually back to back, like Sunday, Monday. And those are usually anywhere from like 2.5 to 4 hours. And then normal runs are usually anywhere from like 60 to 90 minutes. Yeah, I think that's my normal. I mountain bike now. Yeah, I've been mountain biking a decent amount.
Awesome. Where do you like to ride?
I like off of the 06, like Happy Face and over there,
cool.
And then over in Tahoe Donner.
Nice.
Yeah. And then yoga. I usually practice 3 days a week, and then I teach twice a week, but I'm not really practicing during that.
Okay. When do you rest? What does that look like for you?
Yeah. So my rest day, I usually have 1 day like completely off from running, but I have realized that I'm not very good about taking it as an entire rest day. I usually still end up biking or doing something else.
Okay. And how do you know if you're resting enough?
I think I just like listen to how I'm feeling, and usually I can tell like if the next few days like trying to run if I'm like not picking up my feet and I feel like I'm tripping a lot, I feel like it's usually because my legs are heavy because I'm not rested. Yeah, and most of the time, like, a lot of my runs aren't really high intensity, they're recovery runs, and so I kind of look at it as active recovery.
Great.
So
Yeah.
I keep my heart rate low and like I'm not trying very hard.
Okay. Are you familiar with the Zone 2, Zone 5 split? Have you heard it? Have you?
I know that in my Garmin Connect it says that I have an anaerobic shortage always.
Okay, interesting. Some of the things that come up on the computers, the wearables and stuff, when we actually do the testing and we look at the zones, we find they're almost wrong for everyone, and quite a bit wrong. It's one of the reasons I like to do the VO2 max testing, because it's not just the maximum concentration of oxygen that you can consume at your max heart rate. It also has to do with all of those thresholds, going from your aerobic zone into the anaerobic and what the field partitioning looks like. What we find is most people don't have a good sense of where their zone 2 actually is, and most people don't have a good sense of where their zone 5 actually is. A lot of the research from some of the professional athletes who are performing for many, many years at the top level is showing that the best way of training is to do around 80% or maybe even 90% of your training in zone 2. And then 10% of that time-wise is in zone 5 training.
Yeah.
And the zone 5 is the peak heart rate. It's always going to be interval training because you're not going to be able to maintain that peak heart rate for really more than 2 minutes.
So a lot of the time my coach, even like during easy runs, I'll do like 30 seconds fast and then I'll have a recovery. So he kind of puts those in there during my easier runs.
Okay.
So I think that's probably the same philosophy.
Helen, you'd had some questions about injury prevention, and I think it is one of the big things that we try to focus on here, because it turns out over the course of an athlete's career, there's an incredible amount of injuries that happen. Many of them are really unnecessary injuries. There's always the accident stuff that happens, but a lot of them develop from overtraining. A lot of them develop from not training the right way or just not building a fitness base before you go out and push yourself. When we do the blood work, we can get sort of a snapshot on, is there a lot of inflammation in your body? Is your metabolism looking like it's in an optimum place? And I believe that a lot of these things directly contribute to preventing injuries. When we think about like tendinitis, for example, tendinitis is often an overuse injury, but it's accelerated by things like inflammation in the body. It's accelerated by things like insulin resistance. So knowing that, if your carbohydrate load is too high for your energy expenditure, that may make these processes a lot worse. Do you have any thoughts about ways that you've thought about injury prevention, from a physical place, the stretching? It sounds like you're doing a lot of yoga, which is great.
Yeah. I think that helps, and then also just doing like little exercises and like more prehab stuff after I'm done running in places that I know that like I'm typically sore. I think that usually helps.
Okay, great. I know you've had some recent injuries that you've been recovering from. What is your usual recovery pattern? What do you do to kind of enhance your recovery when you get an injury?
Yeah, so luckily I haven't. This was actually one of the first injuries I've had in like probably since college. So I don't typically get hurt very often, but I think one of the main things is like not running when it hurts. So just listening to my body and like giving myself the time to recover.
Okay. One thing we find is that a lot of people like yourself are really driven around training and don't have the discipline to listen to their body because they want to continue to get ready for that next event or that next race. And so there's always a conflict of what is my body telling me versus what is my motivation telling me. How do you balance those conflicts?
Sometimes it's hard because you don't know if like, if I just ignore this one little thing, it'll go away. And I feel like a lot of the time, and maybe it's like through yoga and the other things I do, I have pretty good luck with that.
Okay.
And so then when it gets to the point where like it's hurting while I'm running, I think that's usually when I need to take a step back and recognize that I probably need a break, or I need to look into this more than just
Okay.
continuing to train through.
Great. So more of an active feedback, like you're going out and, hey, this hurts. Okay, I'm going to take the day off today.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What we'd like to develop, and this isn't a perfect science, is we'd like to give people a sense of their progress on training and when they can take a break. Because if it comes down to motivation, most people who are as driven as yourself will train every day that they don't feel pain. And I don't know if pain is always the best threshold for saying, let's stop training. As a professional athlete, pain is one of the things that you've learned cognitively to deal with and to manage so that you can do these ultra long runs. And generally we find people like yourself have a higher pain threshold. So that makes it even more of a conflict to try to figure out, okay, I'm training, oh, it's hurting, how much is it hurting? So what we're trying to build here is really more of a testing-based program to show when should you recover? What does it look like if we have you train this many hours a week and we have you train and recover this many days a week? What would those metrics look like? And I think there's a lot of tools that we can use to establish that. Some of it has to do with things like sleep pattern. Some of it has to do with things like heart rate variability. And then I think other things have to do with your general metabolism, looking at things like glucose variability, looking at cortisol levels. I think there's a lot of tools that we can use to analyze whether or not over a longer period of time, are you overtraining? Are you getting enough rest? And it doesn't just have to be based on, does this hurt too much?
Yeah. So I'm racing a 50K in Mexico on October 29th. And then that'll be the end of my race season for this fall. I don't have any plans to race through winter. That's kind of more of my time of year to recover. I'll
Right.
be skiing more. It's kind of hard to get running in up here, especially when we have big winters, or at least enjoyable running for me.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the spring, I want to run Lake Sonoma 50 miler, which is, I believe, in early April. And then Broken Arrow Sky Race 52K, which is here locally in July. I guess it's June. And then Speed Goat 50K in Utah in July. And then depending on how Mexico goes and if I get in again, I'd like to run 100K as a part of the UTMB week, which is CCC. Or maybe run my first 100 miler. I haven't really figured that out yet.
Wow.
It's the Ultra Trail Mont Blanc. And so
What does that race look like for viewers who don't have a good sense of what it's like to go up Mont Blanc?
yeah, so the 100 miler actually circumnavigates it.
Okay.
And then the 100K, which I ran in August, and I'd like to run again this next August. You start in Cormier, Italy, and then you end in Chamonix.
Okay.
And so it's 62 miles with about 20,000 feet of gain.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's really mountainous. A lot of it's hiking with poles, but yeah, it was a really fun experience, and I'd like to go back.
Awesome.
Yeah, and it's considered like one of the most competitive ultras in the world.
Wow.
There's a lot of people. Like, I think that a lot of the people that I even get to run with, like that are my friends, I look up to. Like, my friend MK Sullivan, I look up to her a lot, and like the way that she has been able to create her career in running and being able to listen and not overtraining. And then people like Camille Herron, she's in her 40s and is still competing at the highest level in these races, which I think is really cool. Yeah, no, I think that's great. Like, something that I feel like I avoid is going to the doctor, because I feel like it's not a holistic approach, and a lot of the time it is like, oh, this is wrong, like take this, and not looking at why that's happening in the first place. So I feel like that's a issue that I've had like with doctors in the past. So I really appreciate this approach and like seeing people as whole people.
What's the worst experience you've had in a doctor's office in terms of maybe just lack of care or just lack of attention to detail? That's probably one of the things I find is the big problem in traditional medicine.
Yeah. Oh man. I feel like there's like been quite a few things, unfortunately, where like I just felt like I wasn't listened to. But one of the more recent things was probably in like the last 2 years, I got an IUD and I wanted it out. They weren't listening to me, that it wasn't working for me. And I like had to fight with my doctor to get it out. I had to make 4 different appointments. It kept getting canceled. And then eventually I was able to get it out, and then they just wanted to put me on like another hormonal birth control when I told them that it wasn't working for me.
One of the things that we find that is a problem with traditional medicine, and it's not the fault of the practitioners in the clinics, because they are allotted a certain amount of time per patient. There's metrics that say that if you don't see your 30 to 40 patients a day, or even in the ER it can be up to 50 patients a day, you're going to lose your job, or you're not going to get a bonus or something like that. So that model of medicine of moving people through quickly causes a lot of problems with attention to detail. It's what we like to do in our clinic is spend a significant amount of time with each person, sitting down, starting with the wellness intake, and sitting down for someone for at least an hour to talk about things like family history, looking at risk factors for disease, talking about someone's individual health goals, their lifestyle, their background, doing comprehensive exams. So I try to be as detail-oriented and as thorough as possible, and also sit down and spend time with people and hear what they have to say.
Yeah, I think I'm looking forward to seeing different levels like in my vitamins and everything, because I think that I eat well and I exercise, so I consider myself to be pretty healthy, but I'd like to see like the different data behind it and to see if there's other ways that I can improve.
Awesome.